Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Freedom Forum, and I'd like to welcome my guests from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Good to be here, Arnie.
No worries, pleased to have you. And Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace.
Oh, hi there, honey. I'm just a little bit dried out. My humidifier went on the blink, and it's cold weather, and
hmm
the humidity was down to I think 15, which is not exactly too good.
Okay, right, yeah, because yesterday we had a 39 Celsius, 39. Today is 29, so it's a lot more comfortable. But I was actually out in the sun yesterday in the garden, in the heat of the day because I don't mind the heat and got a bit of colour. You can see the colour. Do not
I
have
see
a
that.
solarium. I do not pass go to collect 200 at the solarium or any sort of makeup shop or anything like that. It's what you see is what you get with me. How was the weather on the eastern side of Canada, Robert?
It's moderated a little bit. It's supposed to be raining for the next 2 days around the freezing temperature.
hmm
I hope we don't have freezing rain because that creates traffic chaos.
hmm
But it's not particularly cold. But in 3 days, I think we're going to have -20 at night. So that's getting pretty
Well,
serious.
if there is
Yeah.
one thing that mankind can do, it's adapt. They can adapt. I mean, I've got a light shirt on. It's comfortable. We had the heat yesterday. It's quite pleasant. My wife's outside in the garden and enjoying it, and we can adapt. And look at that, -20 to plus almost 40, 60-degree variance, and we're adapting. We're actually working it through. Yeah, no, that to me is wonderful.
Well, we'll
Now,
let you know in a few days if we've survived, Arnie.
well, I
I
think,
don't
what
know.
was it last year? It got to -60 or something overnight. I mean, boy.
Oh, it got in Alberta particularly. I think the
Mm,
temperature goes down,
yeah.
but you get it down to -30,
Mm,
-35 for a day or two at least every
wow.
winter.
Wow.
Well, it's a
Well,
good thing we can adapt, otherwise we wouldn't be here. We're very fragile beings, actually. I
mm,
mean, you look at these wildlife and so on. It's just amazing that they can survive in the extreme conditions that they do.
yeah, yeah. Well, we've got sheep. I mean, they were freshly shorn in October, but they're out the sun. And yesterday they're in the shade. I've got a canopy there for them to get under, and also a couple of trees, and so they can be in the shade to avoid the sting. And they do. But at the same time, they need plenty of water. They need to just not run around and keep their metabolism at a certain rate. So yes, they do adapt, and they are tough beasts. There's no question about that. But hopefully, when they go in the freezer, they're not tough at all.
That's their destiny.
For all those that eat meat. Okay, the
Mhm.
subject for today: federalism or totalitarianism. I've actually been looking around the traps and I see a consistent issue going across. Now, this week we've got the elections in Britain, and you've got the argument from Scotland, from Ireland, from Wales, that they want more representation. And there it is, you've got the central government insisting that this is the way we're going to go. And it's no different in Canada. I'm just going to bring up the article here. With national unity under stress, the premiers back a budget to help oil-rich provinces. So the provinces being the states, basically an equivalent to Scotland, Ireland, and Wales in Britain, or the states in Australia. So the provinces in Canada. And I think it's a fascinating consideration is federalism. Now, on the ALOR website, we've got this 10 advantages of a federal constitution and how to make the most of them. Jeffrey W. Walker, it's in our library. It's a 60 something page article. He was a professor at Queensland University, I think it was, or University in Queensland. And there's also this article in Quadrant that goes back to 2014 discussing federalism. Now, in Australia, we've got this issue of water, and what's going on is the state governments are blaming the federal because the federal has snaffled um, the Murray-Darling Basin plan and they're controlling the whole lot under the Water Act 2007. Constitution says they can't do it. Section 100 of the Constitution says the waterways of the state shall be free, and it deliberately and specifically directs the federal government to keep away from it. Also, the article here about bank and the boards. We've got 4 banks in Australia, and it shows that this idea of centralising power has got actually whiskers on it. There's another article here about water supply in regional South Australia, the issues that are going on with the Western New South Wales with water, and I think that that's probably enough for us to actually open up. My thoughts on the on federalism is that the founding fathers of Australia actually thought this through. And I put it to you that the idea of the states is that the states are local, in a sense, the capital for this principal area for the region, and that you can go and knock on the door of your state representative and you can bark at him about issues. Now, in Australia, the issues are water. Now, the state government, New South Wales, is trying to fend this off, this issue of water off, by directing it to the federal sphere. But in actual fact, it is a state responsibility. And so last week there was a demonstration in our capital city challenging the federal government to do something about it. But in my view, the people who are complaining have gone to the wrong government. They should have actually gone to the state government, New South Wales, because they have been doing studies. They have known about the water issue for years and years and years, and they've sat on their hands and they haven't done anything about it. And now when the pressure is on with the extended drought, they're handing it over to federal government, which they should never do. They should accept responsibility. Anyway, I'll open it to the floor. Wally Klinck, your thoughts?
Well, just to boil it down, I think, Arnie, what you're saying is that they are unnecessarily and unwisely yielding up their legitimate sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the power of their local government, their regional government.
That's right.
And by doing that, they are subjecting themselves to a process of centralization of power.
Yes.
Now, I think that usually what seems to be the case is that when lesser governments appeal to a more centralized government, it's because they are up against financial stringencies,
Mm-hmm.
and they're expecting to get financial assistance from the central government. And this indicates that there is a blockage in the provision of credit in the area where development is needed. And so that it's an unnatural transfer of power. And if you get an unnatural transfer of power like that, what you're doing is you're putting the locus of decision making at a more distant point than the people who are close to the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And where it's conceivable that might work, it is not generally, it doesn't usually hold true, because the people who are nearest to their problems tend, in the first place, they understand the importance of the issue to them and their families and their communities, and they are qualified to say how it's affecting them. But being that they are also accustomed to dealing with those problems, they're probably more proficient in dealing with problems of that particular sort.
Yeah.
And so what you're getting is, because of the financial system being short of purchasing power, inherently short, lesser governments are being driven into dependency upon their central governments and their central banking system and so on, and the ability of the federal government to give grants and so on. Yeah. And this should not be necessary. You should be able to activate your real resources without giving up your freedom.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you, Wallace. In actual fact, within the Australian Constitution and the outworking of it, we have the Loans Council, of which historically, I believe, the states handed a certain amount of power towards the federal government. But the fact is, within our Constitution, the finances for each state can be run within the power of the state. And that is, they can have their own state banks, and they could actually do all of this within our constitution. And so devolution is there if the states are willing, individually or collectively. And in my view, the states are the barons of our day. The barons in Magna Carta were the ones who forced King John to yield. And the states, in my view, are the barons of our day and need to force the federal government to back off. Robert Klinck.
Well, if they're going to function as barons, I don't think they're going to do it on their own initiative, because they are implicated in the political system in a way that makes them ambitious, probably, for career advancement and that sort of thing. So they could function as the barons, but it's going to take a lot of pressure from below, from ordinary people, to get them to do that. But as Wally said, if you remove decision making from local authorities and put it far off, then the result is that people are alienated from the people who are controlling policy, and they don't have any really effective way of expressing their views or their opposition to what's going on. So this is a constant policy of centralization that we see, and it derives from the financial system, who want to emasculate the population by taking their mechanisms for expressing their will in an effective way to their political institutions. So we see this everywhere. In fact, David Rockefeller said in his autobiography, I think on page 409, that the Rockefellers, he and his brothers, were accused of being a secret cabal that were working in the interests of internationalization of the world's economy. And he said, if that's the charge, I stand guilty and I'm proud of it. So people don't understand where the impetus for this centralization is coming from. And it's happening in virtually every country in the world that's got a central bank that is under influence of the World Bank and the IMF. And well, we have the instance of Mark Carney. He was a Canadian who somehow became the governor of the Bank of England. I think this is part of the internationalization of the bureaucracy. They're taking people from different countries and putting them in very, very influential positions. You know, you think, why couldn't they find an English person to be the head of the Bank of England? But he just retired, but now he's gone on to the UN, I believe, and he is promoting climate change. He's going to be putting pressure on everybody to accept this proposition that the world is heading toward an imminent catastrophe because of, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So he's a financier who has taken a step from the financial world into the world of politics in the UN, and he's promoting this climate change thing, which is just a pretext for the centralization of power and for taking power away from every state in the world. I mean, national governments count for nothing in the face of this global catastrophe that's looming, So it's a very, very devious method of operation these people have.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting observation, Robert. I would point out that that in a military situation, troops generally don't turn on their own people, but what they do is they introduce the powers that be introduce mercenaries who are ruthless towards other people, but not generally to their own. And so to me, it's a human trait, and that is that you prefer your own. And it's no different in the area of politics. And that is that one thing I have noticed is the number of foreign-born individuals who make it up the food chain in politics and in industry. And in that, their desire to achieving ends and goals, whatever it is, aren't necessarily conducive for the well-being of the, if you like, the home population. So it really does
Mhm.
separate, and that is the nature of man. You can't deny it. And it's no different when we looked at those articles. We looked at the corruption that's going on in the area of politics and industry, banking, things like that. What it is it's the nature of man to actually compromise given enough temptation. What is your price? It might not be $1,000. Would it be a million? Would it be prostitution? Would it be drugs? Would it be gambling? Would it be power? We recently read, was it just yesterday, a former Australian Prime Minister whose daughter was molested by a colleague, was molested, and he asked that it not be brought out into the public arena because it would affect his career. And I thought, that's what was his. It wasn't money, it was power, it was
Mm.
adulation, whatever it was. That was what his precious was. That's what it was. It was vanity in a sense, and that is so sad that his in this case the situation is just, well, it's horrific. How could it ever come to that? How could it
Yeah.
honestly ever come to that? How could you reconcile what's going on, that your own flesh and blood is being sacrificed on an altar for something that you want? Wally Clink.
Well, it's a rather sad commentary, I must say, but it is an inevitable result of the present financial system that centralizes, that creates insecurity and makes it so we're living in a dog-eat-dog society where everybody's trying to get up higher on the pyramid,
Hmm.
and they'll resort to less and less ethical means to do it as the challenge increases, and that's just the way. We have a very normal instinct for survival. But the problem is we're not living in a normal situation. We're living in a very stressed situation where the financial system is being sucked out of the system in a way that's leaving us gasping for breath, you might say.
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
just not sufficient to do what is required to allow us what we actually can physically and psychologically do quite easily.
Hmm.
So it creates all sorts of problems. And we have this problem in Canada now because there's a increasing divide between the West and the East because of this energy situation. The federal government has meddled in the energy situation, I think, as Bob said, and basically the provinces have the right to determination of the use of their own natural resources.
Hmm.
In Alberta, the Alberta province has the right to administer its own oil, minerals,
Hmm.
and we have managed to allow ourselves to be finagled more and more toward the government, where the government has been allowed to have more and more of a say in these matters. And of course, we now have a government that is headed by a prime minister who is very ideological, who seems to be hostile toward our past cultural history and wants to replace it with a new post-national um, uh, environment, which means the destruction of national governments,
Hmm.
post-national. He's looking to internationalism, solving your problem by going more and more to the center.
Hmm.
And of course, that is causing dissension. It's causing enormous amount of dissension because Alberta, for instance, has depended for its prosperity on its oil exports for a long time now, going back to, I think, 1947 or 8 or something
Hmm.
like that.
Hmm.
And it's caused a really serious situation with enormous unemployment within the oil industry. And our oil industry is very well developed. It's quite sophisticated.
Yeah.
I think it's recognized as being quite sophisticated. And this has caused a rise in suicides.
Hmm.
We have had a certain amount of crime in terms of theft. Also, I think it's caused problems within families, domestic tensions, stresses.
Yeah.
There have been cases of, cases of murder or abandonment of children and things like that. And it's just And now, of course, there is a strong movement, or a fairly strong movement in Alberta for separatism.
Yeah.
But you see, what happened was back in 1937-39, they had this Roll-Surwa report, and it was designed to set up a national situation where every province would be able to have more or less equal social services. And so what happened is they set up this equalization program. Well, of course, it's a redistribution program. In other words, you're taking from some in order to give to others.
Mm-hmm.
And Alberta has paid billions of dollars into this. And Quebec has been a very, very big recipient of this. So it's bound to create, when you try and take an insufficiency and redistribute it, it's not going to solve the problem, but it's going to cause resentments, because some people are going to feel that they're being taken advantage of,
Mm-hmm.
and other people are going to tend to feel that they're entitled to it.
Mm.
And the whole situation leads to a lot of dissension.
Yeah.
And so now they're really trying hard to get support for Alberta, Saskatchewan, and perhaps Manitoba to separate and form a different country.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are thinking about trying to join the United States. Well, that's being driven into another bigger and unstable situation.
That's right. Yeah.
So it's their problem is that they've been accustomed to using oil as a source of revenue through exports.
Yeah.
And the present system works in this way, that it forces nations to try to export more than they import, so they can capture money or credit in order to help compensate for their domestic or internal deficiency.
That's right.
Of purchasing power.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you see, what these people are doing, they're saying, well, this was our source of income, our source of prosperity. We don't want it interrupted. But they're not interfering with the orthodox way of doing things, of trying to export more than you import.
Yeah. They're not going to the root of it, are they?
No, they're not going to rid of it. They don't understand the nature of the financial costing system and the financial credit system or banking system.
Yeah.
And so they're being led, again, in a divisive and in a dangerous way, because if we were to separate, that doesn't necessarily solve all our problems. We've got BC on the one side, which is not always in tune with our way of thinking, and then you've got the East, and we're in the middle. Yeah. We're landlocked, and we're landlocked regardless of whether we're independent or not independent. We're still landlocked, and so I think that it is short-sighted to just go into a fury and say, well, that's it, we're leaving, we're not staying anymore, we're going to leave. I mean, you have to think about the implications of this.
Yeah.
But no matter what they think about, if they do not come to a realization that the present financial system is not self-liquidating, it can't recover its costs, it's not going to solve the problem.
No.
And we felt, our social creditors at the time of the Roll-Surwa report, felt that it was a communist-inspired sort of thing, because it has proved, like, as you're going on and on and on, and the financial pressures and needs become greater and greater, and you're redistributing money, obviously, the redistribution is going to become less and less adequate to the needs, and the resentments are going to be increased. And so it is a revolutionary factor.
Yeah.
And we thought there was evidence to substantiate a claim that it was actually being done by devious elements.
Yeah, design. I think the word I would use is design, Wally, that the deconstruction of society is by design. It's not something that's happening naturally. There are people actually driving it. And of course, by causing one province in Canada to argue against another and to highlight one group as saying, well, we've got the revenue coming in, we've got the natural resources, and we're losing our standard of living. And of course, that's going to cause huge resentment. And of course, it's by design. The issue to me is that the provinces need to actually restore the correct relationship between federalism and totalitarianism. And of course, with the push towards totalitarianism, then of course these things, you can't go to a totalitarian and ask him to sort it. because he won't be acting in your best interest. You've actually got to work within the provinces, and you've got to insist that the provinces exercise their constitutional responsibility. Robert Klinck.
Yeah, well, you were saying, Arnie, you thought that the founding fathers of Australia anticipated a lot of these things and
Yeah.
took them into account in arranging the Constitution. And the same thing is true in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
They said that provinces would have control over natural resources.
Mm.
But when Pierre Trudeau was elected in 1968, there was a big confrontation with Alberta, and national energy policy was established, which subordinated Alberta's control over its oil to the national interest. And this seemed to be a clear violation of the Constitution, but Trudeau was a lawyer and he was surrounded by lawyers, and lawyers can always distinguish cases, and they can come up with other rationalizations for the pursuit of policies.
Mm-hmm.
So in a case like this, all they have to do, for example, is say energy supply is a matter of national security, and then they can put their nose in
Mm-hmm.
and dictate to the provinces. And a place like Alberta, which was generating massive amounts of revenue, which was going to subsidize poorer parts, allegedly poorer parts of the country. I'm not sure they were that. I think they were very clever at managing their finances, so they looked poor to a degree.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, Alberta was subsidizing this. But the problem is that Alberta has a relatively sparse population. So the weight of political influence is in the east. It's in Quebec and Ontario. They've got all the population. So Alberta really, on the national scene, has very little control, very little influence relative to these other areas of the country.
Yeah.
So it's a genuine problem, and if you don't have constitutional protection, the federal government is just going to encroach and encroach and encroach on every area. We reached the point before the recent election we had where the federal government was subsidizing the newspaper industry in Canada.
Yeah.
Isn't that something? It's sheer communism as far as I can see.
Yeah. The
And
propaganda.
they did this just before the election.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't think that these newspapers were happy to be bailed out of their miserable financial situations by the government? It's reached scandalous proportions.
Yeah. In Australia, of course, the taxpayer funds the election campaigns. So much per vote goes towards the parties, and of course it's just as scandalous. Over this past few days, I've actually been fortunate to receive a book called The Struggle for the Snowy, and there it is there. Um, and it's a very important book for this time and for this discussion. And the reason why I brought it up, and while we're talking federalism and totalitarianism, is because the establishment of the Snowy Mountain hydroelectric scheme in Australia, the building of it from the 1950s through to 1970, was actually an area that the federal government did not have the authority to drive, to actually administer. The states were very well aware of it, but the thing is that in the course of the financing of the project and the benefits to the entire nation, what they did was they actually hovered around and allowed the federal government to set up the commission, the Snowy Mountain. I think it's called the Snowy Murray Commission. I think it was like that because there were two proposals of where the water was going to go. The important point about this was it was a very precarious legal and constitutional matter, and the states could have easily challenged the federal government through the high courts, and they would have won because the waterways of the states shall be free of the federal government, Section 100 in our Constitution. Now, the reason why I think it's important is because the negotiations for this particular project went on for honestly, they probably went on for more than 50 years before Federation and then after Federation, before it was actually construction started, and then I think it was about 18 years to actually construct. So it really was a huge project. to harness the hydroelectric power of the water and also to improve the distribution of water to inland Australia for irrigation and drought proofing of Australia. So it really was strategically a very, very important issue, and they were able to successfully work it through within the boundaries of the Constitution on the basis of federalism. That at the blink of an eye, the states could have put the whole project out the window, but they chose not to because it was for the betterment of the country. So it was sort of like handing a temporary lease of power to the federal, or at least the commission, to administer the project. And of course, Australia benefited by it. The commission is still there operating, the power is being generated, but the trouble is it was a public asset and the public paid for it through its taxes and through its electricity charges. But now it's become commercial and it's exploitive. And of course, the end result is that every increase in the price of water, every increase in the price of power, electrical power, also is shown in the increase in prices in the supermarket or when you go to buy something. So it's an inflationary influence, and it's a very short-term perspective. This issue of federalism, this issue of totalitarianism is something that we really do need to keep in the forefront of our thinking, because both nations, Canada and Australia, has a system of federalism, and it's not something that's actually readily taught as part of our civics, our education. And so it's something that we need to actually, what we call bone up, harden up on here. We need to actually do our homework and our study, because I believe a resurgence of federalism is the answer to both issues. What's going on in Canada and what's going on in Australia. And I might make the comment that what's going on in Britain with Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and the trouble with central government in Britain can be answered in exactly the same fashion, and that is a revisiting of this thing called federalism, the actual devolution of power. Anyway, we're past the 32-minute mark. Wally, closing comments, please.
Well, I think was it Professor Keaton who wrote on the death of Parliament? In other words, that the real power of government moves more and more toward the executive and away from the representatives because of the centralization policy. And that is a degradation of democracy, of course.
Yeah.
And it takes power away from the people, and very dangerous situation. And they become quite arrogant about it, actually. They do all sorts of things like these, what do you call it, omnibus bills and things like that, where they'll lump a whole bunch of things together, no matter how contradictory, and you're supposed to vote yes or no. Well, that's just steamrolling.
That's right.
I mean, it's outrageous.
Yeah.
It's. I think the whole procedure just leads continuously to centralization, which means, and I mean, people will do this for two reasons, basically. They're power mad or power hungry because they want to have more power, control over things, and so they want to have their hands on the lever. And or they may be genuine idealists, but being idealists or utopianists, they don't have a realistic view or understanding of the nature of association. And they think that by removing decision making to some central place where the all-knowing people reside, that'll solve everybody's problems. Well, unfortunately, when you go to that location, the people you find are not all-knowing, and sometimes they make mistakes, big mistakes. And when they make a mistake, it can be really disastrous because it affects a very wide area of life.
That's right.
And we simply must devolve power by distributing purchasing power to the individual citizen so that he does not have to go more and more into debt, but can access what's being produced without debt. Because as a country, as a whole, macroeconomically, you produce a certain amount of goods and services. And macroeconomically, as a nation of people, you should be able to gain access to what you've done. What sense does it make to produce a whole lot of things and then say, oh, you can't touch that until you produce another whole lot of things?
That's right.
I mean, it's madness.
It is.
Yeah. At least in my humble opinion, it's really quite crazy.
It is.
And I mean,
Yeah.
that is destroying civilization.
hmm Thank you for that, Wally. That's a very, very good summary. That Keaton book, The Passing of Parliament, is available, Passing of Parliament, and there's also another book called Bureaucratic Lawlessness. I can't remember the author, but it's in our library. Both those PDFs are in our library. So if you choose to go and do your own research and have a look at these things, and there are two books by Geoffrey Duku Walker. One is the Federalism, 10 Advantages, and the other is Citizens Initiative Referenda, the People's Law. Both, again, an ideal opportunity of saying that there are answers out there to what's going on. There are answers about devolving power back. There are legal answers, there are intellectual answers, and what we've got to do is, if you like, pursue the political will that vests with the individual. Closing comments, Robert Klinck.
Yes, these political tensions between different levels of government are sort of inherent in the system, and they will persist in any case. But there's a tendency for the larger governmental unit to have the advantage in these discussions because they end up having greater access to financial power. For one thing,
hmm
they can borrow against the credit of the state more successfully than more regional governments can. So the central government is able to siphon power away from the lower levels, and there is a reaction against this, which is perfectly natural. And there's this phenomenon, for example, that's happening in Alberta right now, the separatist movement,
hmm
but it's not going to accomplish anything unless this financial uh, system is rectified.
Yeah.
Because the financial system has fundamental flaws. One we're aware of is the insufficiency of consumer buying power,
hmm
which is maintained deliberately so that the population is essentially compelled to go cap in hand to whoever has a little bit of money in order to get the means of economic survival. So it's a delusion to think that merely uh, removing yourself from a larger political unit is going to solve the problem if you go out without having done anything about the financial fix.
Mm.
It just won't work, and probably the financial power, which believes in centralization, will punish you for trying to extricate yourself from the drive to centralization.
That's right. That's right. This really is a battle, and it's a battle that must be won. If civilization is actually going to emasculate, sorry, is it going to free itself from the tyranny of centralized power, totalitarianism? I'm just going to do a closing advert here so that people are aware of what's actually out there for them to have a look at. So we look at the ALOR website in our library on the right hand side, the library, and there's all these books that are there. I've been going through Jeffrey Dobbs this year and I've found his writings absolutely wonderful. And also Geoffrey Duku Walker down the bottom on the right. You go far enough down, and he's down there. There he is, and the advantages of a federal constitution, the People's Law. But I wanted to also give an advert for this that's just recently come across my desk, and that is that Mark Anderson is actually doing some good work. Yeah, I believe he's in Canada. I could be wrong, but no, he's in Texas. Okay, Mark Anderson is in Texas. Okay, thanks for that, Robert. And he's doing this here, and I'll make sure that I provide a link on this when I place it onto the web, this video, so you'll be able to chase up Mark. And he's actually discussing things with Jason Mangum at the moment. I believe he's a pastor, and
That's
talking
right.
about economics, Christianity, and what it actually shapes like, what an acceptable shape could look like. So this is our last broadcast in this forum for this year, and I'd really appreciate the effort that's been put in by Robert and Wallace Klinck from Canada. It's been absolutely dynamic in my view. It's certainly been enlightening and inspiring because the thinking, the pre-thought that's gone on for at least the last 100 years by men like Douglas, those that were surrounding around Douglas, and the brilliance of their thinking that's in the Social Creditor, the actual documents, the Eric Butlers, the Jeremy Lees in Australia, and others in Britain, Canada, Americas. We've managed to collect a lot of information that's in the archives. I'm wrestling with our search engines at the moment. If you've been trying to use our search engines, they're actually playing up. But I will continue to pursue that over the break because I think that archiving and study is so important. I've personally only been able to get where I've got to now by the support of these two blokes and others, and the research that I continue to do. It's the renewing of your mind. It's not something that happens in 5 minutes. It takes a while. We've been at this forum on and off in different shapes for at least 2 years, and I think the where we are now is a very important place, especially moving into this the season, the Christmas season. What a beautiful time in our history, in our culture, that God Himself visited earth in the form of man. And the incarnation, He placed heaven and earth here for us to actually not only to physically listen to, see, and speak to, but the record is there to show that the inspiration of the words, the guidance of the words, and the examples set, so profound. And of course, we're 2,000 years into this philosophy, if you like, binding back to the real world, the philosophy of Christianity. It is most beautiful. And of course, Douglas' social credit is a policy emanating from this philosophy, the philosophy of freedom. This is Arnis Luks. Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you, Wally.
Yes, Arnie, it's in the case of the incarnation that we have fallen. Jesus said, "You call me Lord, and you call me Lord, and you call me Lord, but you don't do what I say." In other words, the practical application of Christian principles is an area that we've fallen short of. And one of the very serious problems, for instance, to do with capital development, you cannot properly finance capital development by taxes. Money in the hands of the people has come, it's earned, and there's already a claim on it. It has to go back and buy previous goods so that the cost of those goods can be canceled. If you use it to create new capital assets or anything else, you're creating new goods and new costs. And so that all new production should take place from the creation of new credits, not taxation. You shouldn't be robbing a sector of the economy to accomplish these things. And when they're finished, we should have a national credit account which actually credits society for the value of them, from which consumption can be assisted.
Thank you for that, Wally. Robert Klinck. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Arnie. It's been a pleasure, and enjoy your holiday.
No worries. All right. Cheers, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Merry Christmas.